Hello, and welcome to Arts of Hermes, a show about Hermeticism and the Hermetic arts of magic, alchemy, and astrology in theory and practice and in arts and culture. My name is Matthew Vaughn, and this is the third video in our series on culture. In the first video in the series, I introduced some of the topics, the overall concept of a culture, of occult culture, and of esotericism in the arts. And we talked about some of the themes and concerns that we'll be engaging with over the course of the series, but there's no need to have seen any of the previous videos to follow along with what we're doing here today. As always, if you appreciate what I'm doing here, you can support the work of the show by liking, subscribing, sharing the video on social media, or especially, sharing it with people that you think might be interested in what I'm doing here. You can also find links below if you would like to support my work financially with my Patreon account. All of the work is openly available. I didn't want things to be hidden behind paywalls or to use advertisement or anything like that. So if you find what I'm doing here available and would like to support my work and making it available for everyone who would like to see it, please consider becoming a member there. And you can also buy a copy of my book, which you can find the link to below. So today we're talking about the works of Alan Moore, who's a writer, most famous for his comic book writings, though he's also written several novels and has done some nonfiction writing as well, as we'll talk about. Moore, in addition to a writer, Moore is also a practicing esotericist, a practicing ceremonial magician, and also an anarchist. And we will be focusing on both his own magical ideas, his magical career, and especially the way that magical and esoteric topics are incorporated into his works. So as we've been doing in this series, I will take a just brief look at his birth chart here, and this is something we'll actually come back to a couple times in looking at both his career and the astrological timing of some of the projects that he's been involved with. Let's see. So the first thing I think that strikes us when we look at his chart, which unfortunately we don't have a birth time for, so we don't know his ascendant here, but there's still plenty of information that we can get. I think the first thing that strikes us is the number of planets ruled by Mars. So we see Saturn, Venus, Mercury, and the Sun all in Scorpio, as well as the Moon in Aries. So both signs ruled by Mars. And I think Moore is kind of, in a way, some of the controversies or conflicts that he's been involved with are about as famous as his works themselves are. Some of his most famous works, like from the 1980s, things like V for Vendetta and Watchmen, which I think Watchmen continues to be probably the most critically acclaimed comic book, at least in the English language. But these are works that he's now disowned. They've been made into films, which was opposed to and has refused to take money for the show. He has a famous ongoing sort of feud and conflict with DC Comics, the publisher that he was involved with for a long time, as well as another comic books writer, Grant Morrison, who will be talking about his work in The Invisibles in a future series here. He kind of famously had a feud there with him as well. Even in some of his works, I think Watchmen is probably a really good example of him really being kind of almost attacking or being very critical of the superhero genre, which is something he's continued to do, and I think more recently made statements about the sort of fascist nature of superheroes as a So he's continued to have a very adversarial relationship with his own fan base, his publishers, and really the whole sort of medium that he's working in a lot of ways, which I think is actually quite interesting, and especially in the conflicts with movie studios and the publishers. I think he's absolutely been on the right side, and Mars has given him the sort of strength and courage to not back down and to stand his ground. So I think it's I don't mean these things as a criticism. It's just that sort of martial conflict, I think, just certainly marks a lot of his works. Now, the planet Mars himself, who rules Scorpio and Aries, is actually in Libra, which is a sign that Mars has a little bit of difficulty in. This is a sign ruled by Venus, where Venus and Mars have sort of difficulty in each other's signs. So we see Venus in the Mars-ruled sign of Scorpio and Mars in the Venus-ruled sign of Libra. And so we also see a connection between Venus and Mars themes throughout his work. Despite all of that, the conflictual sort of energy, Moore's works are sexuality and love are really, really common themes, as well as anti-war themes. Sometimes even those things connected together. In the early 2000s, he did a series of explicitly pornographic work, or an explicitly pornographic series called Lost Girls, with his partner Melinda Gebbie, which was a work that, again, although it's sort of an erotic, pornographic work, about sexuality and really standing up for sexual freedom and sexual liberation, but the series really ends in an anti-war statement. It's all basically set on the eve of World War I, and ends with this, the idea that all these young men who should be, devoting their energies towards sex and the sort of pornographic activities that we've been reading throughout the series, but instead those energies have been sort of perverted and are directed towards war and death. So even in his sexual works, his most explicitly erotic works, there's still that connection with Mars. Let's see, and there's more we could say about that, but it might come up as we go through the series, or as we go through this video. And then the last of the classical planets that I think we should talk about here is Jupiter in Gemini. So Jupiter also has a difficult time in Gemini, though I think we really see that in Moore's works, that he has a tendency to be extremely verbose. His novel Jerusalem, which was published a little less than 10 years ago now, is over 1,200 pages long. Even in the scripts he writes for comics, they're famously really long, detailed descriptions of what should appear in each panel. So there's that tendency to produce sort of the sort of Jupiterian inflation and abundance or even excess, combined with in a Mercury ruled sign dealing with words. And so if we because we don't have an ascendant for him, we can use sort of a technique called relative houses. And so if we treat Scorpio as the first house, the sign that the sun is in, we'll see that Jupiter is in the 8th house. And the 8th house, among other things, can represent shared projects, things that we share with others. And all of the works of Moore's that we'll be talking about today, and certainly the works that he's most renowned for and famous, have all been collaborative works. Obviously in comic books, he collaborates with artists, and even in his nonfiction work, or mostly nonfiction work, about magic, even that was a collaboration as well. So I think we really see that collaborative nature of all of Moore's work. All right, let's see. Let's just keep moving on here, but we'll come back to his chart in a few minutes. All right, so just briefly, I just wanted to mention the works that we'll be discussing in this video. We'll talk very briefly about Swamp Thing and From Hell, two of his earlier works. We'll really pick up a focus on him in the early 90s, when he begins his more explicitly magical and esoteric works. So we'll talk probably fairly briefly. I think this will be a fairly long video, so something I might truncate is some of the discussion of these sort of spoken word and musical performances that he did throughout the 90s and into the early 2000s. We'll talk at much greater length about his series Promethea, which is his most explicitly magical. It's really a kind of treatise on ceremonial magic in the form of a superhero comic. We'll talk really briefly about a few resonant themes in the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. We'll also talk about a single issue of a comic that he did for a series by a few other authors called Grandeur and Monstrosity. And then we'll also talk about the Moon and Serpent Bumper Book of Magic, which was published actually just about a year ago, which is he and his collaborator Steve Moore's outlining their theory of magic. All right, so Swamp Thing was an earlier work of Moore's that really helped bring him to prominence. he was taking over this comic and really reinvented and reimagined the character of Swamp Thing rather than as a man who had become this kind of vegetal monster. He really reimagined the character as a kind of plant elemental and used that for exploring some really kind of out there ideas about consciousness, and particularly plant consciousness. And a lot of psychedelic ideas as well. And we'll definitely see psychedelia and the use of psychedelic substances an important theme in his work and in his magical and esoteric practice as well, which, relating back to his birth chart, I've definitely seen in the connection to the sign of Scorpio. I think there's a real fit between that sign and psychedelic exploration. You can see that in someone like Terence McKenna's birth chart, for example, who is someone we'll actually mention again in the course of this series. So that certainly fits. But yeah, we see some of these kind of psychedelic imagery here and trying to imaginatively project himself into this sort of plant consciousness here. Let's see. We also get in Swamp Thing the introduction of an actual ceremonial magician character named John Constantine. So there's obviously an awareness of ceremonial magic even here in the 1980s before he himself becomes a ceremonial magician in the 90s. So this is something that had been on his mind. I know he had read Robert Anton Wilson from a fairly young age, and was definitely always really connected to countercultural and sort of unusual subversive sort of ideas and forgotten knowledge and things like that. So it was certainly something that was always there and always on his mind. And then let's see. So then in the 90s, he did a comic called From Hell, which deals with the Jack the Ripper murders in Victorian era London. And in this comic, he wrote a passage that we see here on the screen that proved to be really decisive for his future career and really for his worldview as well. So here he has the character William Gull, who's a physician connected to the royal family, who, for the purposes of this comic, is using as Jack the Ripper, though he and I think most people don't believe that he was actually Jack the Ripper. But there's a lot of esoteric themes that run through From Hell. A lot of these drawn from Ian Sinclair, who we'll mention again, and this idea of a kind of esoteric configuration of certain churches within London, and then he's connecting that to sort of conspiracies around the Freemasons and things like that, and seeing these murders as a kind of sinister like ritual. All right, so the Ripper, the murderer himself here is explaining some of these ideas to his driver here, and he says, "Scorn not the gods. Despite their non-existence in material terms, they're no less potent, no less terrible." And then the second panel that we've got here is the really sort of decisive one. Gull says, "The one place gods inarguably exist is in our minds, where they are real beyond refute in all their grandeur and monstrosity." Let's see, I'll keep reading here and then we'll come back and talk about that. He goes on and says, "What's Mars but mankind's violent attributions personified, or Aphrodite save mankind's desires? The Homeristic sages recognized all gods as aspects of the One, yet missed the greater truth. The One is us, each with a pantheon of gods in our right brain, whence inspiration and all instinct springs. Athena gives us automobiles, Mars our mighty uprisings. Is that not plague and miracle enough to sate the god of Exodus?" All right, so as I said, in this second panel we've got here, this statement, "The one place the gods inarguably exist is in our minds," more so that he wrote this, just as a line of dialogue, and then it later occurred to him that was true, that the gods do inarguably exist in our minds. And I think in a lot of ways that idea, so even that sentence has really been the core of his entire esoteric practice and his own career as a magician, and a lot of the works that have come later. So it's really interesting that he, that this line came out in a character's mouth, and then only afterwards did he realize that it was true. As he goes on in the panels that follow, we see this sometimes ambivalent relationship about what exactly the gods are. Here we have a kind of sort of anachronistic idea that the gods exist in our right brain. He's obviously referring here to some of the theories of Julian Jaynes here about the bicameral mind, which of course a Victorian era person wouldn't have been able to know about, but that was obviously a reference point for more. And yeah, that's definitely an idea about although the gods inarguably exist in our minds, what exactly that means is certainly something that we can see him sort of struggling with and working with and coming back to, throughout the rest of his life and work. But yeah, this is certainly a kind of epical, decisive moment in his transition into a ceremonial magician. All right, so as he's told the story, it was on the night of his 40th birthday, after having drank a considerable amount of alcohol, that he declared to his friends and family that he was going to become a ceremonial magician. He says that this was not something that he had planned to do, and that he sort of woke up the next morning and realized that he was probably actually going to have to do that now, or else really, look a fool. So yeah, this is the real turning point when he actually becomes a magician and decides to engage in a magical career and a magical practice. So in addition to just being the event in which he declares himself to be a magician, which he recognized is itself a magical act, the power of words and the use of language to shape reality is an idea that's important throughout all of magic and in his works especially. So we can certainly recognize it as an example of that, as he does. But because this is his birthday, it's also his solar return. So as the sun, returns to the same or approximately the same place in his chart, which is an astrological event, right? To get a kind of forecast, for the coming year. So we can look at it as a solar return chart as well. You can also use a technique that's called annual perfections, which highlights different parts of the chart for each year of the life. So here, as he's turning 40, he's entering a fifth house perfection year. So again, if we read houses from the sun, which I think works fairly well for Moore's chart, we end up at Pisces, right? The 5 houses from Scorpio is Pisces, which is a sign ruled by Jupiter. So Jupiter is his time lord for the coming year. And we see Jupiter has just entered into Scorpio. So emphasizing, that Scorpio place in his chart. We see Mercury, Venus, also in Scorpio, and Pluto here as well. Pluto is actually very, very close. Pluto is transiting his natal sun here, and Pluto can certainly be associated with initiation type experiences and being dragged sometimes unwillingly into another world and into another worldview. But I think with Jupiter's presence here also, it becomes a spiritual and uplifting and really enriching and vitalizing worldview. As we mentioned, that sort of psychedelic connection with Scorpio, and I think Jupiter's entrance here really emphasizes that. I mentioned Terence McKenna already, and McKenna has a Scorpio, McKenna has Jupiter in addition to several other planets in Scorpio. So there's certainly something, there's something resonant there in that the psychedelic path as a magical and initiatory and spiritual path. All right, so he declares himself a magician, and then doesn't really know what to do next, and so he talks to his longtime friend Steve Moore, who was already a practicing magician. Moore was also a writer, wrote for a number of comic books, and Moore, throughout his life, was a devotee of the Greek moon goddess Selene, or I think Alan Moore says Selene, so we'll go with that pronunciation. Yeah, so Moore was a devotee of the goddess Selene, and had been also practicing the I Ching for many years, and was more knowledgeable and experienced, and became Alan Moore's constant collaborator and sort of fellow traveler in these magical explorations that they began together in the late 90s, in the late 1993 here. So, as I said, Moore was dedicated to the moon goddess Selene, and recommended that Alan Moore should, in getting started with magic and taking up a magical practice, should find a patron deity of his own. And Moore came across the obscure snake god Glycon. So Glycon was a deity essentially created by a man named Alexander of Abanotychus in the 2nd century AD. Alexander was probably a con man, though there's not really a reliable or definite biography of him available. So in the comic book on the right, where Moore, this is a panel from the comic Grandeur and Monstrosity, where Moore goes through his own understanding of Glycon, and through Glycon speaks about his understanding of the nature of gods and deities. So we can see Moore kind of basically doing a kind of recapitulation of Alexander's performances that he would do with the god Glycon, where he had a live snake whose head was concealed under his arm, and then using a kind of glove puppet that had this human head and a full head of hair to then speak to the assembled crowd. Glycon's he actually managed to form a substantial cult to Glycon, which persisted for I think over a century and a half after Alexander's death. So Moore, I think, was really this obviously hoax nature of the god and the sort of ridiculous kind of like glove puppet appearance really appealed to Moore, and Moore adopted Glycon as his patron deity, and had, over the course of his life, had a number of genuinely magical sort of religious experiences of actually encountering Glycon, receiving information from him, and this sort of paradox or contradiction between being a fake sort of hoax deity but also a real deity at the same time is a really core idea in Moore's understanding of magic and the gods as well as the human mind and the ideas and a lot of the concepts that we'll be talking about throughout the rest of this video. All right, so in this comic book takes place in a world in which like all of the gods from all the different pantheons have all become like real, literal sort of gods on Earth, and now Moore, again, doing a kind of recapitulation of Alexander's act with his sort of hoax god, is addressing all of these really literal gods and claiming to be the only true, actual, real god, because he is, as a real hoax, in a sense, is the only god that's actually, unlike the literal gods that populate the comic book, he's the only god that's actually in line with Moore's own understanding of what deities are. So we'll just look at a few of the panels from this comic here. So let's see. So now this is Glycon, speaking through, obviously the idea of Alan Moore here as a character in the comic book, doing the Alexander's like ventriloquist act, and so speaking sort of as or through Glycon here. Although, as we'll see, the idea is also that the opposite is happening as well. That even as Moore is literally like ventriloquizing or doing a ventriloquist act and making it look like the snake is talking, it's also that the Glycon as a real divine idea is inspiring Moore's words. So we have a kind of paradox that in a sense the god is ventriloquizing through the man at the same time that the man is ventriloquizing sort of through the god. All right, so sort of Moore / Glycon here within the comic says, "What I'm saying is they knew I was a puppet from the start and they worshipped me anyway. Pythagoreans had by then incorporated Neoplatonism, which saw gods as conceptual essences without material form, ideas that could only be expressed through representation. So Moore's trying to understand how something that is so obviously a hoax could possibly have started a real cult that endured for over a century after Alexander's death. And his interpretation here is that they are right, that these people are actually very sophisticated and understand gods as what he's calling conceptual essences, and that Alexander's act would have been understood as a representation of a real idea, not as a literal god incarnated as a human-headed snake, or a semi-human-headed snake. I mean, he's got hair, but still has sort of a snake head. All right, so continuing on, Glycon continues to speak. He says, this is the only way gods manifest, in paint and props and poetry. I am not the docile python or the false head or the borrowed voice. I am the idea that generates these things. So, of course, this is the glove puppet within the comic book speaking about, the paint and props and poetry as that which sort of produced Alexander's ventriloquist act. But of course, we can also read this as being about comic books themselves, that this is also true of the comic, that even though this is just a drawing and some words on a page, that doesn't mean that the ideas coming through are necessarily not real. That the idea that generates the comic book and the words that we are reading are real ideas. So continuing on, Glycon says, as an unprecedented, honest fake, I am made true, no more or less than what I claim to be. Behold me, for I am a real idea, the only real God you will ever witness. So again, he's saying this to a group of literal gods that inhabit this comic book universe that Alan Moore didn't create. He just only wrote this one issue here. Again, maybe a nice sort of slightly Mars kind of example again, that in a way this whole comic functions as like a critique of the series that it appears as part of, that these literal material gods that inhabit this particular comic book world aren't really actually gods because they're not ideas. All right, and then still continuing on, now as the act goes on, Moore actually begins to disassemble the god. The snake is put back in his cage, and then the puppet is taken off. But Glycon continues to speak even as this is happening. And he says, "Our God," as if the material form is being withdrawn or let go of, but the idea itself persists, beyond its material appearance. All right, so Glycon says, are gods unreal then? Not at all. As ideas, we have changed your world beyond all recognition. We have brought enlightenment and slaughter. Do not doubt our power. Just try not to be so literal. Try to remember how you built us out of glue and muslin, or, of course, out of comic books, out of words, out of hieroglyphics, out of statues and images and drawings on papyrus, whatever. Try to recall what gave you the idea to do that. Respect your gods, respect your ideas, or they will surely kill you. All right, and then at the very end, we have a kind of a narrator, or a named narrator here. So let's see, as with much of the surly Hierophant's later material, people were left with a sense of disappointment. There's a whole kind of self-satirizing sort of thing here, right? That talking about Moore himself here, people being satisfied with his dissatisfied with his later works. The god's speech, with its annoyingly superior tone and its regional British accent, was not widely reported. The world continued on its journey. People chose to think they had ideas rather than that ideas had them. Vast populations were moved this way and then that by immaterial concepts, economics, politics, religion, unaware of their manipulation by these spectral entities that work us, that supply our every word. So again, that kind of paradoxical reversal that even though we, in a sense, create the gods or their appearance, it is the gods as real, living, in some sense, sentient or agential ideas that move through us or speak through us. And the idea that we need to become aware of that in order to be able to more consciously intervene in the direction of our world. And as we'll talk about, this becoming more conscious and able to operate within this immaterial world is really the core of Moore's own practice and work as a ceremonial magician. All right, so jumping back in time, that I don't know if I said that that comic Grandeur and Monstrosity was done in 2014. So after he'd had plenty of time to develop a relationship with Glycon and come to better understand him and his sort of significance for his worldview. But yeah, we're jumping back to kind of the initiation of the whole project right around the time that he first became a ceremonial magician. So a few months after his 40th birthday party, where he became or declared himself to be a ceremonial magician and began to work with Steve Moore. In January of that year, he and Steve consumed some psilocybin mushrooms, as they had done many times in the past, just intending it to be recreational, not intending to do any magic or ritual, but they had a really powerful experience that gave them a lot of the material for what would become their collaborative magical project, and really the ideas that Moore would continue to work through in a number of different mediums, as well as in his own personal spiritual practice for at least the next 30 years. As we'll see, this project, I think, really turns on the Saturn's cycle here. So we see Saturn at 29 degrees Aquarius here, and we'll see other important milestones as Saturn moves through the fixed signs, so making the squares and oppositions, and then eventually returning to Aquarius in the early 2020s, just a few years ago, as this project really kind of comes to its final fruition. Saturn's obviously quite important here. We have Mars, Venus, the Sun, Mercury, as well as Neptune and Uranus, all in Capricorn, and Saturn in Aquarius. So very strong Saturnian energy here. Obviously, Jupiter's still in Scorpio here, because he's still in his fifth house perfection year. We also see the Moon in Scorpio and very close to Pluto as well, emphasizing some of that Pluto kind of initiation, being pulled into another world and another worldview. That we've already sort of talked about. We also have Pluto exactly square or to Saturn here, which the Pluto-Saturn cycle is an important cycle in mundane astrology that we could maybe think about in connection with Moore's works, though. Yeah, I don't know if we want to do that right now. Let's see. I did want to mention, though, that this Uranus-Neptune conjunction, the Uranus-Neptune cycle, is often connected with the emergence of not just new ideas, but really radically transformed worldviews and new spiritual ideas. Before this Uranus-Neptune conjunction that started in the mid 80s and lasted into the 90s. The previous conjunction had been in the 18 teens and 1820s, coinciding with the height of the Romanticism. So there's a similar kind of feeling here. This particular Uranus and Neptune conjunction in the early 90s is linked by people like Richard Tarnas to the emergence of the internet and the idea of the internet as a kind of global mind, a sort of nervous system or brain for the entire planet. Also around the same time, we have ideas like the Gaian mind becoming really the idea of a planetary consciousness becoming more common here. Terence McKenna, who we've mentioned before, was talking a lot about the idea of a Gaian mind and accessing this idea of a planetary consciousness through the use of psychedelics right around this same time. The internet, of course, is a very literal, material version of this idea, and this idea of a sort of shared mind space or a shared idea space becomes, I think, really the core idea in Moore's own understanding of magic and really his understanding of art and creativity and really like human culture and history going forward. And as he's spoken about, it was really this shared experience that he had with Steve Moore and the way that they really seem to be inhabiting the same space and sharing ideas, as well as some other experiences he had that really helped to bring forth this idea in him. So this is, definitely an initiation and the start of his collaborative project with Steve Moore. All right, let's just keep moving on. So as I said, you can see the Saturn cycle, the stages of his magical work and publishing connected with the Saturn cycle. So let's see. So here we see Saturn moving into Taurus now. So making a square, the first square after of this particular cycle that started in late Aquarius with the previous chart. And so this is the publication of the first issue of Promethea in August 1999. Whether this is the exact moment, I don't actually know what date it was actually published. And obviously he had been working on Promethea, for a number of months before this point. But I think, this first quarter of the cycle here, he's now starting to, to produce this sort of central work in this project of expressing these new ideas that had been, so powerfully revealed in that initiatory experience in 1994. Right, and then in 2007, he and Steve began working on what will become the Moon and Serpent Bumper Book of Magic, really their kind of magnum opus, their summary and treatise on their understanding of magic and its history and its import and its practice as well. And so this is happening as Saturn moves into Leo, so now beginning to make the opposition to Aquarius. So we're at the halfway point in this particular Saturn cycle that that again began with that important experience when Saturn was in Aquarius. And then in March of 2014, Steve Moore died, which put kind of a hold on the project for a while. The final piece of writing for the book, the postscript, was finalized in December of 2014. So this is really the time when the book, although basically becoming complete, or the content of it becoming complete, also entered kind of a fallow period where it really wasn't clear for a long time whether the book would ever be published. And this is happening right as Saturn is at 28 degrees Scorpio, so making a square to that early position in Aquarius when the project started, or to the position at 29 degrees Aquarius when the project started. And so now entering the third quarter of this Saturn cycle, where the book kind of lay dormant for quite a while, until early 2021, according to John Coulthard, who did a lot of the book design, where he says that the project was sort of really revived in early 2021. And we can see that at the opening of 2021, I think I set this chart for January 1st. Yeah, let's see, 11 Capricorn. The sun's at 11 Capricorn, so yeah, that would be January 1st. So right as the sun is entering Aquarius, the Saturn is entering Aquarius, so Saturn's returning, to the sign that he was in at the time that the project was initiated. The bumper book is revived, and the final, the work of actually designing and assembling the book really begins here. So we can see this cycle that started back in 1994 after Moore's 40th birthday coming to a head here. And then finally the book is published a year ago on the 15th of October 2024. So Saturn has now moved into Pisces, into the next sign, but obviously the actual publication process takes some time, even if I think for Moore the project really sort of finished or came to a conclusion with Saturn and Aquarius. Though interesting to note here that Uranus and Neptune have moved from their conjunction that they were making at the time that the project was first started in the early 1994, and have now moved into a sextile. So the full Uranus-Neptune cycle is longer than any human life span, but this sort of opening sextile of this new cycle that we're in, is an important sort of milestone there. And that sextile continues. Neptune's moved on to Aries, and Uranus has moved on to Gemini as of the time of this recording, but the aspect continues. So we're still sort of in this opening, this sort of marker of the opening sixth of this new cycle that we began, in the early 90s. And I think, we've obviously seen, what the internet, for example, has meant so far, and how different it's really been from what was imagined. I think it's an interesting moment to reflect on some of those themes, like, again, the idea of like a planetary consciousness, or Moore's idea of a shared idea space, and the way that this book, maybe also can be read as looking back at that moment, because I do think that the book is really a product of the time that it was begun. I think the Alan Moore's and Steve Moore's magical worldview was really formed in the 1990s, when the chaos magic movement, especially in Britain, was really at its height. And I think their sense of where magic was, and the fact that movement was really a dead end, and that we needed something new, that it needed to be revived, was exactly correct. I think their instincts were really true, and I think we can continue to celebrate that. It's just that by the time the book was actually published, that revival had already been underway for a while, so the book now feels a bit behind its time in a lot of ways. The revival of things like astrological magic and traditional astrology, the work with grimoires and spirit traditions and things like that have really unfolded since the 1990s, as well as the boom in academic study of Western esotericism that's offering a really renewed and enriched history of the Western esoteric tradition. All of that has happened since the time that this project was begun. So I think maybe in some ways it makes a lot of sense to read the entire project as a product of the sort of the mid 90s when it was conceived. Certainly, these are old, deep traditions, and something that's 30 years old doesn't just immediately become redundant, but it really does feel out of time in a way. So there's still a lot of value there, but I think it really helps to read it as almost like a lost work from the late 90s or early 2000s, rather than a work that is really speaking to the moment that it's actually appearing and being published. All right, so again, this is a collaborative work, not just with Steve Moore, but also with a number of artists. Really tremendous book design by John Coulthard, who is a really great illustrator and is someone who also has a lot of connections to a culture and esoteric culture. And I think in a future video, we'll be able to come back and talk about him a little bit more. I think he's an interesting figure. Also, art by the comics that appear throughout the Moon and Serpent bumper book, which, it mixes sort of text and comic book styles, and there's full of illustrations. We can see an example here of John Coulthard's design from one of the pages here, really sort of florid and psychedelic. And tapping into some of that sense of the multimedia sort of presentation that I think more took some inspiration from like Alexander's performance with Glycon, this kind of like multimedia sort of presentation being a way that magical ritual could happen. Obviously really inspired also by a lot of the happenings in the 1960s and things like that, but trying to translate some of those ideas from his like kind of performance work and things like that from the 90s into like a sort of grimoire. So it's a kind of like psychedelic multimedia grimoire. But there's a number of comic sort of comic book style sections. Those are done by Ben Wicke and Kevin O'Neill. And there's also some additional art by Steve Parkhouse and Rick Veitch. All right, so just want to talk briefly about what's actually in the Moon and Serpent Bumper Book of Magic before we jump back in time to when the project actually started in the 90s and go through some of the other works that were produced as this cycle moved along. So the book is arranged. We have a series of different like repeating sections that are interwoven with each other. What I think is really the core of the book is some sections on both the theory and language of magic, as well as some practical things. And then there's some kind of comic and there's some fiction and some comics that are interwoven throughout that. The theory and the kind of mapping of the magical landscape is primarily being done through the Hermetic Qabalah, which more tends to spell with a K. A lot of Hermetic Kabbalists tend to spell Kabbalah with a Q, but more uses the K spelling. That's more usually seen in connection with like Jewish Kabbalah, but I don't more prefers that spelling for whatever reason. And the Tree of Life. There's also quite a bit of tarot instruction throughout the book. They're obviously really mainly using the Thoth tarot done by Aleister Crowley and later Frida Harris, though I don't know, perhaps they just didn't have the rights to be able to publish it because we don't actually see those cards in the book, which is a little bit funny. We do see some cards from a deck that John Coulthard designed, as well as the Tarot de Marseille, but not the deck that they're largely referring to. So that might be helpful if you're going to read those tarot sections to refer to the Thoth cards. We also have sections about their conception of spirits, gods, and as well as fictional entities and how to work with them and how to conceive them as well. A lot of this is practical as well. They sort of following, I think, Alan and Steve's own practice. They suggest making an idol or an image of your, of choosing a patron deity to begin your practice with, and then making an idol or image of this deity in line with the artistic nature and creative nature of the entire project. They really emphasize using, art and creative projects as a vehicle for magic and a way to do and engage with magic. I think that idea of choosing a patron deity as a way of starting off as a magician is a really nice idea. I've never really encountered that elsewhere. I mean, that's something you sometimes see in like pagan circles and things like that, people trying to choose a patron deity. But yeah, I think it also makes sense as a way of engaging with magic here. Emphasizing, as we'll talk about, the really exclusively mental or inner imaginative approach to magic. We have a lot of sections on magical visions of various kinds, whether through dream work or astral travel or scrying, and in line with Moore's own very sort of psychedelically influenced or the use of psychedelics in his own ritual work. There's some discussion of using entheogens for magical work as well. There's some stuff about doing tarot divination. Also some talk about about like transgression and the use of like transgressive or breaking taboos as part of a kind of liberation or a way of generating like magical power, which I think is partially a product of its time. They're obviously really thinking about Aleister Crowley and the Thelemic tradition as well there. And as I said, there's also some advice about working with entities. The two kind of comic book style sections, one is the Adventures of Alexander, illustrated by Kevin O'Neill, where we get the story of Alexander and his sort of show with Glycon, as well as Alexander's relationship with the goddess Selene as well, which is something they didn't know about at the time that they more chose his deity Glycon. So there's an interesting relationship between the moon and serpent that I think really developed as their project went on, and even seeing historical roots of that relationship as well, which is quite interesting. We also get, I think it's in 50 parts, Old Moore's Lives of the Great Enchanters, which is the lives of various ceremonial magicians, both real and fictional through time. These are interesting. I mean, there's a lot of good figures there, though there's also, I think, a lot of missing pieces. And again, I think some of this comes off as a product of its time, and to a certain extent, a product of, I think, Alan and Steve's own, opinions and thoughts about magic. So there's certainly missing pieces. We see very few like Arabic names, for example, despite I think there's a few references to how important, the Arabic tradition is for, for all of Western esotericism, though there's very little about it. I think Jabir ibn Hayyan is mentioned in like one sentence, but I thought that was an unfortunate oversight. Just other sort of slightly idiosyncratic choices so I would really just take this with a grain of salt. I mean, there's a lot of good things there, a lot of interesting stuff, but for example, we get like Ian Sinclair, is mentioned, who, I mean, certainly there's an esoteric component of his work, and he's an important writer, but we don't have Israel Regardie mentioned, for example, who I think is, if we're trying to be objective about it, would certainly be a more influential figure in 20th century magic. But so in any case, just take all that with a grain of salt, as I think we really should everything in the book. There's also I think it's broken up into 6 parts. There's a fictional narrative here called The Soul, which details a woman in early 20th century England beginning to engage with magic. Unlike Promethea, this is actually a relatively realistic story about someone entering onto the magical path and undergoing a series of magical initiations that also very closely fits a lot of the experiences that Alan Moore himself had working with magic. And there's also real parallels between the story of the soul and Promethea. In all of these works, there's always a really great autobiographical component that, to a great extent, they are autobiographical, that Moore's own magical experiences and magical workings are being more or less directly incorporated into the text, which I think both gives it a lot of charge, right, that he's not just imagining what these ceremonials would be like, but he's actually basing the content of these things on real experiences that he himself has had. It also makes them very interwoven. Reading this book could really function as a key to understanding what's happening in a lot of the other magical works and in interviews and things like that as well. All of the things that we're going to be talking about today, I think, really form a kind of interconnected text that are all rooted in Moore's own magical practice, or at least his magical practice in the 1990s. I think it's been quite a long time now since he actually really actively practiced magic. I think for him anyways, his art, his writing is his magical practice. So a lot of these experiences are really rooted in experiences that he had in the 1990s and the magical work that he did there. And I think that's important to understand for making sense of his project and these works that come out of it. Let's just keep moving on here. All right, so as I said, the main sort of system that he's working with, the main map of the magical universe and the immaterial universe, the imagination that he's working with is a version of the Qabalah and the Tree of Life. So this is a kind of like post-Golden Dawn version of the Tree of Life. So I'm sure a lot of you watching this will already know a little bit about the Tree of Life. So we have these 10 Sephiroth arranged in this tree pattern, each one representing a level of, I think for Moore, they're representing a level of consciousness. Other than the lowest, or the 10th sphere Malkuth, which is the physical world, the other 9 above it are various levels of consciousness, at least in Moore's understanding here. So for Moore, as with a lot of Hermetic Kabbalists, the primary way of engaging with these levels is through their planetary attributions. So we see the attribution of the 7 classical planets arranged in cosmological order, from the fastest to the slowest. So we have the moon at the 9th sphere, up to Saturn at the 3rd sphere of Binah, and then to even more abstract spheres above that. Moore also works with this 11th sort of hidden Sephiroth called Da'ath, that is located between the supernal triad, the 3 Sephiroth at the top of the tree, and then the 7 below it. This is something that you sometimes see emphasized in some versions of the Hermetic Qabalah, but Moore is absolutely working with it. I also realized reading the Moon and Serpent Bummer book how much the colors attributed to the Sephiroth really matter for Moore's own understanding, and I think the way that he experienced his own, the rituals that he did to enter into these modes of consciousness and then have experiences and visions, which he brought back into the work. I think the colors were a huge part of his engagement and his way into experiencing these modes of consciousness. So the colors we're seeing here are what's known as the Queen scale. This is something that came out of the Golden Dawn. It's one of the 4. There's like 4 different color scales for coloring the spheres. We can talk about that in some future video because it's actually fairly complex. But these colors that we see here, so the supernal triad, the top 3 are white, gray, and black, being the most kind of abstract and sort of unreal in a sense, or distant from the sort of finite world. These are sort of beyond existence. And then below that, we have the 4th, 5th, and 6th Sephiroth in blue, red, and yellow, the 3 primary colors. And then below that, the 7th, 8th, and 9th Sephiroth in the secondary colors of green, orange, and purple. And then finally, the sort of tertiary colors mixed together in Malkuth as citrine, russet, olive, and black, representing the 4 elements within Malkuth, among some other things as well. And we'll come back to this as we go through some of the works where this map is used. All right, so throughout these works, Moore really details his own kind of ontology, his own understanding of the nature of reality and the nature of what's real and in what sense it is real. So we get kind of a dualism here. Ultimately, in these works, there's always a mystical sense, especially the states of consciousness associated with like the upper regions of the Tree of Life. There's a sort of unitary sense that everything is all one thing, that dualism is always overcome. But nevertheless, we really get a sense of there being 2 different separate realities. So represented by what I've got, I just sort of created this table to try to give some sense of how he's splitting things up. So on the left-hand side, we have the physical material level, and then on the right-hand side, the space of imagination and consciousness and ideas. And then we sometimes get different ideas about how to bridge or connect between these 2 things. But yeah, there is, in a lot of these works, a fairly hard separation between the realms of the material and the realm of consciousness. Let's see. So in the second row there, we see in the individual human, we have the separation between body and consciousness. This is really a kind of basically a kind of Cartesian dualism, where you have the 2 separate substances of matter and mind, or body and spirit. Moore is never really clear about exactly how these things connect. Usually this is done through the human brain. I mean, Descartes sort of speculated along those same lines. I think Descartes sort of favored the pineal gland as the place where the mind touches the body. But that is, of course, a persistent problem for any form of dualism, is how does the mental substance and in what way does the mental substance interact with the physical substance? I think rather unfortunately, Moore has a very anthropocentric, very human-centric way of thinking about this, and really imagining that imagination, although he makes imagination so important and really like fundamental and foundational, he does see it as something that's basically exclusively human, and rather like Descartes, actually, that only really that contact between the two realms, the realm of consciousness and then the physical material realm, really only happens inside of humans, which to me feels really out of date. Maybe another place where this is really like a product of the 1990s. There's been so much work done about animal consciousness, plant consciousness, even like fungal consciousness in the last few decades that I think is really like transforming, even in the realms of fairly hard science, is really like transforming our conception and really dissolving that sort of anthropocentrism and sort of Eurocentrism. So it's, I think, unfortunate to see this, again, it being a bit behind the time, though, maybe especially for when it was written now, but even today to an extent, just treating, the realm of consciousness and ideas and mind as equally real to the material. I think that's something that's still worth celebrating, even if I wish that the interconnection and sort of interpenetration of those realms was extended out beyond the human. I'll have more to say about that as we go along. So again, with these realms on the physical material side, like plants and animals basically remain entirely within the physical in Moore's understanding of these things, which, as I've said, I certainly disagree with. And then in the realm of pure imagination or ideas, we have things like gods, spirits, and ideas themselves, which Moore is often quite ambivalent about to what extent those things are real and to what extent they exist outside of human minds. He sometimes seems to say that it may be that gods and spirits are only, aspects of the human unconscious that we just don't have like direct access to, though at other times, especially in the works of fiction or the creative works themselves, he tends to give more agency to these things, as we saw with that that presentation of Glycon in the Grandeur and Monstrosity there, where the ideas themselves sort of have us or speak through us, even as, we speak through the images of the gods that we've created, which I think is a much more complex and interesting and magical way of viewing it. I think that idea, that we saw from that panel and from hell, the place, that it's unarguable, the one place that the gods inarguably exist, is in the human mind. I think Moore really kind of staked out that position and has really dedicated himself to defending it, which is, there's certainly something kind of scorpionic about that, right? This sort of like a fixed Mars, that you sort of take a position and hold it and defend it, which, there's certainly something admirable about that, but I sometimes feel a sense of frustration in, especially reading the Moon and Serpent Book of Magic, that there seemed to be an inability to push beyond that place into some of the realms that I think, have really opened up like in the last few decades and become more accessible. Anyway, but we certainly get some of this idea of humans as interestingly sort of between these two worlds, between like the physical and the idea space. In Kabbalistic terms, Moore tends to see, as the Hermetic Qabalah basically always do, seeing Malkuth, the 10th and lowest of the Sephiroth, as corresponding to the physical and material world, and then somewhat idiosyncratically, he really associates the imagination with the 9th Sephiroth, the one just above Malkuth, which is attributed to the moon. So we get this sort of dualism between Malkuth and Yesod, or between Earth and the moon. More typically the imagination would be seen as a bit higher up the tree, but the way that he's particularly arranging it, imagination is going to be associated with the sphere of Yesod and with the moon. And so then the paths that connect the Sephiroth, there are 22 paths, each one attributed to a Hebrew letter, as well as in the Hermetic Qabalah to one of the trumps or the Atu of the tarot. It's attributed to the 32nd path, the last letter of the Hebrew alphabet, Tav, which is the world or the universe in the tarot. So that 32nd path, will become a really important feature in Moore's works or understanding, and that I think he really sees the next step in progressing, magic and art and human culture and society is to take that trip up the 32nd path and to really realize mind and consciousness and ideas as a fully real place and as a place that's shared. Again, I think that's a really core idea in Moore, is that the mind and ideas are not something that's private to each one of us as individuals, but that we can actually journey out beyond into ideas that don't come from us as individuals. I know a metaphor he likes to use for that is the idea that like physical space, we each have our own house or our own apartment or whatever that's ours, which is like our personal individual mind. But we can also step outside our front door and go out into the wider world and encounter things that are, not part of our personal individual space. And so that journey up the 32nd path, or sometimes things coming down the 32nd path into Malkuth, becomes the key sort of event in his understanding of magic, and something that will, as we'll see in Promethea, becomes an actually like apocalyptic event that transforms the whole world. Let's see, just a few other things here. Along with that dualism of physical and consciousness, we also get science and art and magic. I think one thing that Moore is really trying to do is to not in any way come into conflict with like mainstream scientific understanding, to allow science to completely have its own domain, and to simply say that there's another realm, of art, magic, and spirituality, of ideas and consciousness that like material empirical science can't investigate. And that's what art and magic can do. And magic especially is given a privileged place as being able to explore this other world that science sort of can't touch or know about. In the Moon and Bumper Book of Magic specifically, which this may be coming a little bit more from Steve Moore. It's not, they don't give attributions within the book of where it's Alan's ideas and where it's Steve's ideas. So this may be coming a bit more from Steve, though Moore also has talked about ideas like this in interviews. We have a kind of dualism between low magic and high magic. So low magic being magic associated with particular results, which was a really big idea in the chaos magic movement of doing like sigils to produce very, specific changes in the world, basically getting things that you want, bringing yourself, money or love or whatever else, which Moore doesn't have really any respect for at all. Though in some ways his rejection of, I'll say something about high magic too. So then high magic would be this idea of exploring consciousness, of spiritual transformation and personal transformation and initiation, and the creation of art. This is what he's calling high magic, and connecting to this kind of like Renaissance sort of idea of magic as like with John Dee and people like that, of a spiritually exalted art that is separate and distinct from this sort of dirty, dark realm of sorcerers and people whatever cursing each other or trying to make love potions and things like that. So let's see. I have a few things to say about that. One thing I think is that in a lot of the academic work that's been done in the last few decades, that distinction between low and high magic has really fallen apart. It's really just not possible in the history of Western esotericism to make that distinction. I think Moore has some really good criticisms of, especially the way that chaos magic approached results. Seeing it as almost like a kind of magical analog to like the reign of Margaret Thatcher, this sort of neoliberal ideology of just sort of seeking like benefit for yourself and very like material benefit too, like wanting money and material possessions and things like that. There's something demeaning about those sort of exclusively focusing on those sort of ends. I think is a really good point. Absolutely. But yeah, it just doesn't hold up, and it really reinforces that hard dualism between between the material and consciousness. A few times especially in the Moon and Serpent book of magic, Moore talks about the idea that if you could, or both, Alan and Steve, I think it's easy and I've heard other people do this too, of imagining that the entire Moon and Serpent book of magic is all Alan Moore's ideas, and forgetting about, Steve Moore's contributions there. But yeah, they put forth the idea that anything that can be accomplished through like mundane, worldly, sort of physical action should be done that way, and that magic should be reserved for things that are sort of exclusively in the realm of consciousness and mind and ideas, which I think just really reinforces that sense of dualistic separation, between spirit and matter, and that while taking physical action in the world is certainly. It certainly should not be neglected by the magical practitioner. We can't rely, entirely on, the use of magic or enchantment to get the things that we need to maintain our material lives. There's no reason that we can't do both. There's no reason that you can't both, do ritual work, to get a new job and, submit applications, So it reminds me of that, the joke about the guy, whatever, you're praying to God to win the lottery. And then, finally God comes down and says, it would really help me if you buy a ticket, right? The buying of the ticket, it's not like they're mutually exclusive. It's not like you have to choose between, are you going to do practical action in the world, or are you going to do magic? You can do both. And my own experience, as well as the experience of a lot of other people I know, is that doing both together is really the most effective way of doing magic. And it's unfortunate to see them not giving space to that idea of we're operating on both levels simultaneously, as a way of weaving those two things together and a way of bridging that divide. So I certainly think that's a weakness there. I do also think, and this definitely is Alan Moore's ideas about the rejection of low magic, that there's a kind of he gives too many reasons to reject it, which ends up feeling a bit suspicious. He says in some ways that it just doesn't work, that magic can't possibly have an effect on the physical world, but then also gives, sort of moral reasons not to do it, which I think are quite specious. He rightly points out that, doing a ritual to try to, get someone to fall in love with you or sleep with you is actually ethically equivalent to, slipping something into their drink, that should be considered a form of sexual assault. That's absolutely true. But that's hardly an argument against doing any form of practical magic. That's just to say that, the ethics of magical practice are the same as the ethics of non-magical practice. Like if you do something to hurt someone else, it doesn't really matter whether you're using, magical ends to do that or a weapon, physical weapon or whatever, right? The ethics are still the same. But again, that's not an argument against practical magic. It's just to say that we have to have the same sorts of ethical concerns that we would have with taking a physical action. I think there's something to the point that there's something kind of demeaning to magic or to the gods or spirits by enlisting them to simply fulfill our desires and whims. Though I don't think that there's anything necessarily demeaning about invoking the aid of spirits or other beings or magical powers to participate in your worldly life. I think that's a real sort of false dualism. So one thing that comes up a number of times in the book that I think is worth paying attention to, because I think it points towards some of the limitations of the book and the place that I think practitioners reading the work and reflecting on it critically would do well to pay attention to is the question of coincidence. They, like really anyone who practices magic with any kind of devotion and depth and sincerity for often even not that great a length of time, experience is the coordination of, well, both the coordination of inner and outer events, whether that's the coordination of magical ritual with things happening in the world that the practitioner has no like direct responsibility for causing, as well as the meaningful or sort of symbolically meaningful coordination of outer events. So this is taking us into the realm of what the surrealists called objective chance, which is a concept that we'll talk about when we do a video on surrealism. What William Burroughs calls intersections, what in Jungian language is referred to as synchronicity. This, I think, is a real and very important place where the two realms of spirit and matter, of the material and the imagination cross over with each other. That is clearly not limited to the human brain, and so doesn't really fit in with their dualistic sort of ontology, or at least the way that they're setting it up. I mean, there's ways that you could maintain a kind of dualism. But yeah, I think this, although they have these experiences, they tend to, at least the way that the book is written, dismiss these as being probably just coincidence, or always explained away as coincidence, in order to maintain this idea that magic can never affect the outer world, rather than allowing themselves to realize that the levels of consciousness and the material, even outside of individual humans or individual like living organic beings, are interwoven at all of those other levels as well. So yeah, I think that's just something to pay attention to, and something that points towards a way out of the limitations of this kind of separative way of conceiving of magic and the nature of reality. All right, so moving on, I just wanted to outline some of the kind of core ideas and reference points that recur in Alan Moore's magical world, and his both his writings about magic, as well as the more esoterically inflected works that we'll be talking about. Within the realm of magicians and Western esoteric practitioners themselves, some common reference points are Alexander, who we've already talked about in Glycon. Aleister Crowley is a really common reference, and Thelemic philosophy and ideas, and a number of figures from the mythology of the Thelemic holy books. We'll see a few of those a little later in this video. The Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, of course, the Victorian era or Edwardian era magical order. Also, Austin Osman Spare, who we mentioned in our last video on Coil, and I'll be doing a video about Austin Osman Spare at some point in this series. I'm not quite sure where yet, but yeah, we'll do a video about Austin Osman Spare, and we'll see Spare appear in Promethea in a little bit here. John Dee and his work, Enochian angel work, is a common reference point as well. Also, William Blake is a really important figure for Alan Moore more generally, and a lot of Blake's, although Blake isn't like a magical ritual practitioner, a lot of his ideas about the nature of gods and angels and spirits, and the equal reality of the imagination is really important for Moore. As I said, Robert Anton Wilson, I think, was a big influence on Moore, especially when he was younger, and helped to shape his, the sort of flexibility and his of mind, and his willingness to entertain, sort of outside ideas. Though also, I think that Wilson's the sort of skepticism that he deploys is also, I think, contributes in some ways to some of the limitations of like some of the things we were talking about on the last page. Yeah, I don't want to say too much more about that, and just keep moving on here. He also mentions Joel Baracco, who's a fairly obscure figure. He published a a kind of journal at least in the 90s, maybe starting in the 80s, called Chaos, Khaos. But a chaos magic practitioner that I guess had a lot more respect for. I've read some bits and pieces of some of those journals, but I don't know that much about him. But anyways, he's a common reference point as well. All right, so some core ideas for Alan, magical ideas for Alan Moore. There's what we've already mentioned, the shared idea space. We've already mentioned a few things about it. Another thing that Moore likes, kind of story that Moore likes to invoke to talk about this is the notion of like shared or simultaneous invention, the way that things like the steam engine or the telephone or photography, that you sometimes get people almost simultaneously but unrelatedly inventing the same thing, as if that idea were itself sort of presenting itself to humanity, and then some people sort of pick it up. That's also a thing that I think he sees in the arts, that there are certain times when certain ideas like come through and get captured or brought into the world, through the work of a number of different artists who aren't necessarily getting the idea from each other, but are all sort of simultaneously tuning into the same idea. Psychogeography is an important reference for Alan Moore. Psychogeography is a kind of a difficult thing to sort of pin down. Ultimately, it traces back to this sort of tradition of like the flaneur, this idea of like wandering in urban spaces that sort of came out of the kind of French like decadent and symbolist sort of era. It gets picked up by the surrealists, who are interested in investigating these kind of hidden places within urban realms, almost like the kind of unconscious of a city. The Situationist International develops this a bit, though they really don't have any of the esoteric sort of side of it that the surrealists are at least potentially open to. It becomes really big in the UK, especially like in the 1980s, a lot of it through the work of Ian Sinclair. But just the idea of being able to move through urban spaces, often in a kind of semi-intentional or semi-directed way, and seeing especially urban spaces as not just what they are physically, but also the historical references and sometimes a kind of esoteric like geography that happens, the way that the traces of what used to be in a place or events that occurred in a place remain there. So kind of like investigating the astral or imaginal dimension as well as the historical dimension of things. And there can be both like magical as well as totally non-magical versions of this. But that's certainly an important idea for Moore. Even in some of his less magical works, I think place becomes really, really important, and I think a lot of his works are almost more about particular places than they are about like individual characters. Certainly his novel, Jerusalem, is basically about the city of Northampton. And you can see that in a number of other places. It's often either Northampton or London that he's focused on. Which for Moore, I think, really transitions over into almost being like fully within the realm of the imagination. Compared to some other practitioners. But yeah, that's certainly an important idea for him. Also, Moore, as we've already sort of said, really equates magic with art, and also language with magic, and seeing often through, by calling on the mythology of both Hermes and Thoth as both gods of language and writing, as well as gods of magic, the connection between the ability of language to create and manipulate the worlds that we live in, and magic, to manipulate consciousness and to thereby change, our experience or even the nature of the world itself, manipulating consciousness. But yeah, Moore really equates magic and art, which I think in some ways is limiting of magic. Certainly I think it's true for him that his magic and his art are the same thing, though to state that about all magical work I think is going a bit too far. He often opposes magic to religion in connection with at least his understanding of anarchism, and the idea that religion is always about like binding people together, which which is literally what the etymology of the word religion, but then also connecting that to like the image of the fasces, the fascist image of the bundle of sticks, bound together, and seeing this always as like authoritarian and limiting. Let's see. Also, seeing magic as a sort of an alternative to religion, a way of having spirituality and mysticism and contact with higher realms without the downsides of religion is an important idea for him. We've already said that sexuality figures in quite a few of his works, and he's definitely interested in sexual magic, which is a huge thing in 20th century magic. Basically coming mainly out of the works of Aleister Crowley, Austin Spare, was a big part of the chaos magic movement, and so Moore is definitely participating in that. With Moore, you also really see a sexual mysticism that seeing the creation of the universe or the ultimate nature of the universe as a kind of ongoing sexual act, or that the transformations of consciousness that happen in sexual union, leads into, at least potentially, or opens into a mystical state. And that's something we'll see going forward in this video. Let's see, we also encounter the idea of what is referred to as eternalism, which seems to be an idea that Moore really ended up with on his own. I think largely through some of those early like psychedelic and magical experiences that he had in the 1990s. The idea that every moment, everything that ever exists continues to exist, that each moment is eternal. He often likes to invoke at least a certain interpretation of Einstein's theory of relativity and the idea of what's called the block universe. That the universe is a sort of four-dimensional crystal or solid that never really changes. It's just that our consciousness only moves through it one sort of time slice at a time, but that we actually exist as these time-extended beings, extending from our birth, all the way to our death. But that everything is just sort of always the way that it is, and that all those moments continuously exist, sometimes expressing the idea that at the moment of death, our consciousness simply like loops back to the beginning. So it's sort of an idea like Nietzsche's eternal recurrence in a way, except even more like static. It's not that we cycle around to the same thing, but that all of the moments of our lives just continually exist in this like kind of 4-dimensional or 5-dimensional view from outside of space-time. Is an important idea for him. I think that I think there's some problems with that idea, that it doesn't emphasize the possibility of change and transformation, that it emphasizes like the static and immovable nature of things, though, I mean, that perspective outside of time is certainly a really important magical perspective. But yeah, we can come back to that later in the video here. Already mentioned mysticism, in connection with sex, but love as well. We often see, as we will see with Promethea, the highest revelations are often, connected with love, and a kind of universal love and universal unity is, I think certainly important for him. We've already talked about the importance of psychedelics and his use of, throughout, I think, a lot of his early ritual work. Definitely, I think, all but one of his experiences with various entities, sort of angels and demons, and the god and Glycon as well. Most of those experiences, though not all of them, happened under the influences of psilocybin specifically. And there's certainly a psychedelic aesthetic and psychedelic themes that permeate a lot of his works, for sure. He also really likes this idea that the origins of all human culture can be traced back to a kind of original like shamanism, and that magic is really the original, all forms of culture, or all areas of culture and knowledge are all originate in magic and in magical practice. This is an important idea for him. Sometimes this is connected to come back to Terence McKenna once again. Terence McKenna's like stoned ape hypothesis, as it's usually known, the idea that early humans ingesting, maybe accidentally at first and then intentionally ingesting psilocybin mushrooms help to potentiate transformations in consciousness that may have developed language and culture, religion, magic, and given us ideas and really kickstarted the transformation from animal consciousness into human consciousness. Whatever you think of that idea, it's certainly an important idea for more. Also, if you've never seen the Bill Hicks routine where he acts out on stage the stoned ape hypothesis, it's certainly worth looking up. It's pretty entertaining. Another important idea related to human culture and its origins and development is he uses the alchemical processes of Solway et coagula. You dissolve and coagulate, to like analysis and synthesis, taking things apart and then putting them back together. Really seeing the place of human culture and society, especially I think in the time that he's formulating a lot of these ideas, like in the 1990s, in connection with sort of what's referred to as postmodernism, in the sense that everything has sort of dissolved into its individual components, and that there's no unity, no unified or like grand perspective on things, but everything's been broken down into its separate little parts, and that everything is sort of relative and fluid. He expresses this as the idea that we are living within magic's dismembered corpse. That from that magical origin of all human arts and culture, things have been chopped up into their little components of art, science, religion, entertainment, technology, politics. Every sort of sub-discipline, all the sort of sub-disciplines within the world of science, and so on. Everything's been dissolved into its component pieces, but that it's now time to start putting the pieces back together again, and seeing. I think he sees magic as a way of, beginning that process of reassembling, what's been dissolved. And then finally, I'll just mention that he often talks about the need for a new counterculture. In part, you could say that he is, imagining counterculture as only able to exist in the sort of youth counterculture of like the 1960s and 70s when he himself was young. But, I think there's something really to it, the way that the internet and the way the real changes that have happened in human society and culture that we can, associate with that Uranus-Neptune conjunction have changed really the possibilities of the formation of countercultures, that everything has become in a way kind of like dispersed throughout the internet. I think I don't want to dwell on that too long. I just think it's an interesting connection to some of the astrology that we already talked about there. And it's certainly an interesting theme, an important theme for him, whatever you want to make of that. All right, so related to this idea of living in the dismembered corpse of magic, this is a quote from an interview that was in the Quietus a few years ago. There's also a similar passage in the Moon and Serpent bumper book in Magic, but I thought that this was a nice particular formulation of it. Let's see, so he said, we are living amongst the dismembered corpse of magic in its original form of shamanism, but the head of magic has still got something to say. Meaning like the head, like, the arms and legs and torso have all been separated off into like, the different arts and sciences and so on. Right. So going on, he says, what I think might be a useful approach, perhaps impractical, but bear me out. I think that if we were to reconnect magic and art as a starting point, because they're practically the same thing anyway, make art the product of your magical experiments, the way that Austin Spare did, for example, then that would give magic an enormous sense of purpose, and I think it would also lend art the vision that it seems to be lacking at present. A lot of modern art seems rather empty and hollow conceptualism that lacks any real vision or substance or power. A linking of magic and art would help both of these fields. Then, once you've done that, maybe linking art and science. So, whatever you think of that idea, it's certainly, I think, a guiding vision for Moore's work, and also really resonates with the theme of this video series on a culture about the relationship between magic and art. And I think it's certainly an important articulation or an important perspective on how magic and esotericism is related to the arts, and to culture. All right. So something we see in Promethea and some of his other works, he draws on the 4 magical weapons that come out of the Golden Dawn tradition. They are, the Golden Dawn is drawing on the suits of the tarot, or the esoteric interpretation of the suits of the tarot that emerges in originally the late 18th century into the 19th century. The 4 magical weapons, the 4 suits of the tarot of wand, cup, sword, and then more often uses the word coin. A lot of people use the word disc. Pentacles is more often the term used in Wicca, but again, the 4 suits of the tarot as well. So they correspond with the 4 elements of fire, water, air, and earth. And then in different works and different traditions, you get different interpretations of what this mean and how they correspond to different other ideas and sets of symbols. But for more, at least the way he uses them, the wand symbolizes will and spirit. It's often connected to creativity and impulse and direction. The cup for more really symbolizes compassion and emotion. I think I've never seen him make this distinction explicitly, but love tends to be something rather higher up and unifying, whereas the cup, I think compassion, emotion, and feeling is more at the level of the cup for more. The sword for him symbolizes reason and intellect, and that, the sort of power of analysis, the power to cut things up into pieces. And then finally, coins or discs are like the physical material world, the world of the senses. And then in more recent things, like in the Moon and Serpent Bumper Book of Magic, you have an interesting extension of these ideas into, this idea of the dismembered corpse of magic and the pieces, where the wand is, what remains of magic itself. The cup corresponds with art. The sword with science, and then the coins or discs correspond to the realm of politics. And he, seeing these things as a kind of downward flow of the energy or the process of manifestation flowing down, from the wand to the cup to the sword to the disc, from fire to water to air to earth, which is very similar to the process of moving down, like through the tree of life, down through the Sephiroth into the material world. I think he also sees this as a model for how we can, reconnecting magic to art and then to science, and then finally moving this into the realm of politics, allowing, both things like compassion as well as the will or spirit, and also, reason and intellect of science to, guide our practice of politics. All right, and then finally, this video is definitely going on for a while, so I'll cut it into 2 pieces like I did with the last video, but we'll just close out this section with a final quote here. I used this quote in the first video on a culture, but I just wanted to return to it again because I think it, in the context now of everything we've said about his other ideas here, I think it has some extra significance. So he says, with relation to the magic, I can remember one of the last conversations I had with my very dear and much missed friend, the writer Kathy Acker. This was very soon after I had just become interested and involved with magic. So this would be like in the mid-90s here. So he says, I was saying to her how the way I was then seeing things was that basically magic was about the last and best bastion of revolution, the political revolution, the sexual revolution, these things that had their parts and had their limits, whereas the idea of a magical revolution would revolve around actually changing people's consciousnesses, which is to say, actually changing the nature of perceived reality. Kathy agreed with that completely. It sort of followed on some of her own experiences, and I still think that is true. In some ways, magic is the most political of all the areas I'm involved with. Just connecting up magic and politics again, as we saw in the last quote, and thinking about the significance of magic for the world and for the way that that we actually live our lives and organize our societies and everything else is certainly something that is in the background of a lot of his works. And there's as he's spoken about, there's always a political and a social dimension to his understandings of magic. And we'll see that, especially in some of the thing in things that happen in Promethea, and the nature of a kind of revolutionary transformation of the world related to magical ideas and to magical consciousness will be really the overarching theme of the Promethea comic. All right, so I think this is a good place to stop, and I will be back in the next couple days with the second half of this video. So thanks for watching. Remember to like, subscribe, share the video with anyone you think might be interested in it, and I will see you in just a couple days with the second half, where we'll look at some of the specific works of Alan Moore. All right, until then, take care. Bye.